Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this Ad Age custom webcast sponsored by Neustar. The topic of today's webcast is How to Swim in Data, Best Practices for Managing Multiple Data Streams and Sources. I'm Christopher Hosford, your moderator for today. Now, before we begin, we have just a few quick items to go over. We'll hear from today's presenters, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So to participate in the Q&A portion of the webcast, all you have to do is type your question into the Ask a Question text area below the presentation window, and then click the Submit button. You may submit the questions at any time during the webcast, direct them to a specific speaker if you wish, or just to the panelists as a whole. We'll address as many as we can as time permits after our presenters' prepared remarks. Now, also note the series of little widgets that are available to you towards the bottom of the console. Several of them are for social sharing, as you can see. Now, let's get started with today's webinar, How to Swim in Data, Best Practices for Managing Multiple Data Streams and Sources. Our presenters for today are Leslie Petry, Director of Solutions Marketing, and Rob Gatto, Senior Vice President of Media and Advertising, both at Neustar. First up is Leslie. Leslie Petry brings more than 18 years of experience in marketing, technology, and strategy, and is currently Senior Director of Neustar's Solutions Marketing team. Prior to joining Aggregate Knowledge, a Neustar service, Leslie was co-founder and Vice President Marketing of CenCE, a digital media startup delivering SaaS services across all consumer electronic devices. A strategic marketing veteran, Leslie has held management positions at Hara Software, National Semiconductor, and Zoran, Inc., where she led marketing strategy, product positioning, and go-to-marketing efforts across various technologies and verticals. Our next speaker after Leslie is Rob Gatto, who oversees Neustar's efforts in media and advertising. Now, Rob brings plenty of experience as well. Before joining Neustar, he was president of media analytics firm Aggregate Knowledge, which Neustar purchased earlier this year. And with more than 25 years of experience in the technology industry, he also was CEO of PointRoll and held executive positions at ShopLocal, now a retail division of PointRoll, Hyperion Solutions, and SPSS. Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Christopher, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everybody on the call. What I'd like to do is first walk you through the agenda for our next 45 minutes. And what we're going to be doing is exploring a survey that Neustar and Ad Age commissioned together to look at how brands work with multiple data vendors. And we'll be answering some questions around how many data vendors do marketers use to execute campaigns? Is working with multiple data vendors a struggle, and why? And how can we best measure and analyze different sets of results? And towards the end, as I turn it over to Rob, we'll look at best practices around 3 critical questions that will help manage your vendors and your data better in the future. And then, as Christopher mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session as well. So now let me walk you through some of the data. And let me start by giving you an overview of the commission study that Neustar teamed up with Ad Age on. And the goal of this was to get a full picture around data vendors and data partners. So we worked with Advantage Business Research to conduct an online research study, and we are looking at the data based on results from 421 respondents. The survey represents 421 responses, like I mentioned, across a handful of different company types. So when we talk about agencies, 45% of the respondents represented ad agencies, media agencies, or PR agencies. 38% represented marketers. And of that marketing pool, it was made up of a handful of different industries, such as technology, which was about 9%, retail, 6%, internet, 5%, financial services, 4%, and then other industries made up the other 15%. So you'll see it was a well-rounded group coming from different backgrounds. And then the 17% represented media companies that includes magazine, newspaper, digital, TV, radio. And from an average annual company revenue, those represented include revenues of $246 million with average employees of 1,950. And the respondents' job titles ranged a bit, but the most respondents came from those in the media space that represent directors or managers, heads of business, such as chairman, president, CEO, and partner, SVPs and VPs, and then 10% came from account supervisors or executives. So that gives you a sense of the respondents and the types of companies that were covered. Now let me walk you through a handful of key stats that I think will help inform what people are seeing in this space in terms of the types of vendors that are being engaged to execute an ad strategy or a campaign. So based on the results, 67.9% of respondents are using measurement and analytics vendors, 65.6% media buyers, 54.2% campaign execution, and then data management and data vendors. And what I find interesting in these results is that you can see as we go through this stat and some others following is that marketers are working with a handful of different vendors to execute not only single campaigns but execute groups of campaigns. And so what we'll try to do as we walk through is highlight the stats, and then Rob will help give some commentary on either client examples or what we're seeing in the industry that is related.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I think in particular on this slide, I find it interesting. Measurement can often be time-consuming and difficult without a strong base of data to work from. And so I think it's interesting here that measurement and analytics is at the upper end, yet data management systems are at the lower end of the range. A few examples, I have a number of clients who have tried to start with attribution from a measurement perspective, only to find it takes a long time to get implemented, and often the results aren't what they expect them to be without having a good, strong base of data to work from. So I think this is, and you'll see as we move along, that analytics and measurement are important, but we'll find that it eats up a large portion of time, the generation of those sorts of things from a client perspective.
Thanks, Rob. So as I move on to how many vendors are being engaged at any given point in time for a typical campaign, and this is interesting because if you think about executing one campaign, the average number by type of vendors that are being engaged is 6.6 from a media buying perspective, 4.6 for campaign execution, and 3.5 for data. And then you'll see on the lower end measurement and analytics and data management. Now from a perspective of average percent of total time that's being spent on a typical campaign. So campaign execution, as you can see, takes up the majority of a marketer's time. And as we go down the list, media buying, measurement and analytics, data management, and data. And what I would say this suggests is that there's an opportunity to streamline across vendors, not only the types of vendors that are being used for a particular campaign, but also the number of vendors that are being used. So if you're trying to drive down the total time it takes, there's an opportunity to create efficiencies as you start looking at the types of vendors that you work with and the amount of time you're spending with them. Now let's look at budget. So we've talked about the number of vendors, the average percent of time. Now if we look at how much money is being spent across these different vendor types. As we can see, again, media buying, campaign execution, and measurement and analytics are the top three. But as Rob pointed out earlier, what I think is interesting is that the amount of budget that's being spent from a measurement and analytics, data, and data management perspective is on the lower end. yet those may be areas that would help inform and give insights into the data that's needed to make your media buying and your campaign execution more efficient. Now let's break that budget down into the time that's spent and the amount of money that's spent. So if we look at the average current budget that marketers are spending on measurement and analytics, you'll see that it's about $77,000. And that's annual, which tells you it's just about $6,000 or $7,000 a month that's being spent on measurement and analytics. And 57 hours are being spent per month on generating analytics reports. So think about that today. A lot of that happens in different groups across the company, generally in Excel spreadsheets, and it's oftentimes siloed. So I think that the data definitely proves that there is a lot of time and effort going into reporting that may not be as streamlined as it could be over organizations today. The other two stats here relate to budget. So 25% of marketers have had their budget changed from 2 years and expect that to change the 2 years going forward. And 43% actively log in at least once a day to a measurement and analytics platform.
Leslie, I'd also like to add here, and the 57 hours of generating reports is a key statistic. I think there's a huge opportunity here to shrink the amount of time spent on building and assembling data and spend that time on more strategic analysis. The general nature of our industry as far as different devices and channels and the explosion of fragmentation of media, you've got programmatic, publisher direct, as well as site serve type opportunities from a media perspective, are all things that then need to be coordinated on the back end in order to do any sort of analysis. And I think anything that advertisers can do to coordinate that data and clean it and prepare it will offer up significant ROI opportunities for more strategic analysis as opposed to hours being spent assembling the data.
And Rod, that's interesting because now if we look at the next question around do you struggle when working with multiple vendors, and what we see from the findings is that 37% strongly agree that objectively comparing results from different vendors is difficult, and 28% strongly agree that their efforts are duplicated when they're dealing with multiple vendors.
Yes, very true. I think it shows right here. I mean, each vendor has their own singular focus from a data as well as a measurement perspective. And then often departments within an advertiser pull from different data sources in order to assemble the metrics that they're interested in. I really believe there's an opportunity in our industry, much like there was in the ERP industry, to come to a single version of the truth, to make sure that we're all pulling from the same data set, that the calculations are done off of the same data sets, so at the end of the day, the return on investment is all done off of a single version of the truth.
Great. Now let me move to the next slide where we're talking about measuring and comparing vendors and what parts of that is so difficult. So similar to what Rob mentioned, the highest respondents rate was 67.5%, citing that the lack of a platform to centralize and compare data was difficult, and that different vendors are using different metrics. So I think asking the same question a couple different ways, we ended up with the same results, which is good. It's very telling that there are some challenges around how to compare the data in terms of it being siloed across organizations and then not having similar metrics. So you may be pulling from one specific channel, whether you're running on social or you're running display, you're pulling from your different vendors, and there's difficulty in looking at those metrics side by side and really correlating that and coming up with your next steps of action. So one key question that we asked was around verification systems. And are vendors or are customers using verification systems to check vendors' results? And what we found is that 63.2% are not. And my guess would be that they're not using them because it's very difficult and because there are so many different vendors that are being used today, it's hard to correlate across and come up with, like Rob, you mentioned, one system of truth.
Right. I can actually highlight here. There's two key metrics that we find clients benefit from when doing the verification. The first is frequency. We typically see 15 to 20% of a given campaign is served at a frequency level that is beyond optimal. What I mean by optimal is we normally work through the desired action for a given campaign, and we'll go ahead and calculate what the optimal frequency is in order to achieve that action. And typically we see 15 to 20% of a campaign being served above optimal frequency. And then the other is audience delivery. And again, this is actually fairly simple. In the area where you're buying audiences, usually those audiences are contracted at a point in time at which the cookies are available. And then by the time the campaign runs, we often have a different picture given the degradation of the cookie world. And we find ourselves again at 20 to 25% miss on audience delivery. And I think that there are tools that allow you to track those. An ad server will allow you to track and set frequency caps. But even in organizations that have a centralized ad server, we still find optimal frequency issues. We can then begin to think about how you break it down by a more granular level where you get into campaign groups, you get into media partners, you get into specific audiences by media partners. I like to think of it as a Rubik's Cube. The ability to do the sort of measurement and analytics around this sort of verification has a tremendous return on investment potential for money saved that could be spent in other areas.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Now, as I move on to the next step, we look at centralized reporting tools. And it's interesting because you look at those that are currently in use, and you'll see 63.2% do not currently use centralized tools, although 63% rate centralized tools as extremely beneficial. And so you might think about what different tools you're using today, those that could be streamlined, and maybe specific vendors that you're working with if they have more depth within their offering, the ability to add on different parts of their solutions so that over time you do get to this centralized world where you are looking at metrics across one single platform. Now, what types of measurement and analytics tools do those respondents use? So if we look at the first three, the top one of 65.8% is custom web analytics and optimization tools. Next is social engagement at 63.9%. And then you'll see budget management allocation at 51% and tag management at 46.5%. And what I find interesting in the results here is that people are using measurement and analytics tools, but they're being used for different things, one. And then also what it points to is that those tools are being used to look at campaigns, for example, web being separate than social, being separate than multi-channel funnels. And so it may point to an opportunity for you to look at using the same measurement and analytics tools across all the different types of campaigns you're running and across all the different channels where they're running. So again, getting to this kind of cross-channel view of everything that you're doing so that you're looking at those metrics from a single perspective versus across different silos. They're not being able to match the metrics to each other. So what do you use reporting and analytics platforms for? And the top one, Rob mentioned it earlier, so I think it's great that we have results that show ROI measurement at 76.8%. And I think that that's huge, as we know CMOs are being asked to quantify their budgets, not only to maintain their budgets, but also to grow their budgets. And as monies are moving to digital, there's now this impetus for CMOs to be able to give metrics around efficiency in their spend, why they're spending on certain channels and why they're spending with certain types of campaigns. And so being able to make sure that there's ROI measurement is obviously key, and then that trickles down into how do you correlate it to spend planning and how do you correlate it to the creative planning process as well. So when we asked what matters most to you when selecting a data management platform, The top responses included reporting and analytics, user interface and ease of use, data ownership and security, segmentation and user profile management. And as we go through the presentation and towards the end, Rob will definitely focus on the data ownership and security piece and how that relates to reporting and analytics. So as we see, many think that that's extremely important, and I think being able to help them understand the value in using this platform and why you would look at ease of use is very specific to our industry. Rob touched on this a little bit earlier, but when we look at cross-channel and understanding the interplay between campaigns and between your audiences, one of the questions we asked was around, do you measure audience overlap today? And what I think is very interesting is that almost 60% do not measure that today, despite us believing there's huge value. So Rob, I'm sure you have a comment on that.
Yes, this is actually one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit. We often see as high as 30% overlap amongst media partners on a given buy, especially if there's a couple of areas. One would be in the retargeting space. If people are using multiple retargeters, we often find duplication. In the programmatic space, if you're using multiple DSPs, we often see a fair amount of duplication. And then, frankly, overlap can be good as well as bad. Overlap between your upper funnel campaigns and your lower funnel campaigns is really what you're interested in. You want to move people throughout the purchase funnel. And so I do find that being able to see and measure overlap is a very important thing to tuning campaigns and finding additional money in ROI out of campaigns. I think this will be interesting as we move into a cross-device environment today. This is done at the cookie level, and I think there's lots of opportunities for return on investment and opportunities for improvement here in the cookie world. I think it will be interesting to see as we begin to connect cross-device, your laptop to your tablet to your phone, and we're able to deduplicate and see people across those three types of devices, what sort of overlap do we have in the media buy, and frankly, how does that work within the purchase funnel? So I'm actually pretty excited about where we're headed in this environment, but I do think this is low-hanging fruit for any advertiser.
Great. Thanks, Rob, for those comments. And let me just do a quick recap before I hand it over. So in looking at the data, what we found from the 421 respondents was that multiple data vendors are today's reality. Respondents engage with an average of 6.6 vendors as part of the media buy. So it's something that we're not going to get over anytime soon, but I think there's a huge opportunity for us to look at how do we streamline that process. And as we look at centralized reporting tools for demonstrating value, so although only 37% of respondents are using a centralized reporting tool, 63% of users rate them as extremely beneficial. And then the last stat I'd like to recap with is ROI measurement. And as we mentioned, this is the widest use of reporting and analytics platforms. 77% cite this as a top reason why they would want to move in this direction. So now let me turn it over to Rob to address 3 best practices for managing your data.
Thanks, Leslie. I'll wrap us up with 3 short slides here. So the first is, number 1, ensure your customer data is secure. I think you need to understand how many partners actually have access to your data. I do believe the future of our industry and the success advertisers will have will be based on use of their CRM data. That CRM data is the lifeblood of who your customers are, what attributes, what do they look like, how do I find more of them, how do I suppress them when I'm doing advertising for things that they've already purchased, how do I cross-sell and upsell. I think it's very important to be able to protect that data. I think you have media partners, you have measurement partners who all are clamoring for that data, and a centralized place that you can control and then control the distribution of that data would be very important. So I think at the end of the day, the least or the lower number of vendors you can have that actually touch or have access to that data, the better off you'll be. The second key tenet here is making your data more accessible. Keep in mind that digital performance data is only one part of an advertiser's overall data set. There'll be data sets from television. There'll be data sets from potentially print, direct mail. There might be data from their call center. There's certainly data from their website. And at some point, all that data has to be combined, put together for analysis, back to that single version of the truth and understanding the truth 360-degree view. So I think it's very important to understand how can you get this data in and make it more accessible. Make it not only more accessible for reporting, but maybe more accessible into a larger data store that has all of your other data. And then the last or the third tenet here is know who's using your data. Frankly, I think it's important to understand what partners have access, how they use your data, how they're leveraging it. I think you have to be very careful with partners that may have a dual purpose. So somebody who does measurement in media buying at the same time, there's a question in my mind, be careful about how they utilize your data. Right? They may utilize your data for your particular media buy, but depending on how you shared that data and how it's structured, you have to be careful that it doesn't go towards enriching other portions of their business. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I think open it up for questions.
Sounds great, Rob. And Leslie, a terrific presentation, just as we expected. Yes, keep those questions coming in. We already have several good ones for both Leslie and Rob, but we can always use more. So let me open it up to the attendees, and the first question would be on tying online spend with offline spend. One of our attendees asks or says, I'd like to tie online spend and influence to the transactions that happen in store. How can I do this effectively? Who'd like to take that? Rob, does that sound like a question for you?
Yes, I'd be happy to take that, Chris. So this is something that 12 months ago was very complicated. Today is still a challenge, but is increasingly becoming easier to do. And I would say the percentage of our advertisers that are looking to do this is probably up around 60-70%, whereas a year ago it may have been 10 to 15. The process is actually very simple. Your CRM data or your sales file has personally identifiable information in it. You typically take that file and you match it with a third party who has offline household or offline individual data. Once that match is made, usually the match is at a fairly high percentage, 95+%. You now have a match between the third party and your sales data. That data is then anonymized, and it is matched down into the digital world, usually at the cookie ID level today. And that match rate is anywhere from a low of 30 to maybe a high of 50-55%. Now I have an idea of the folks who have purchased, and I have a corresponding anonymous cookie ID for that purchase, which I can now look at the media exposure that cookie has seen. We also are beginning to do cross-device, which is rather than attach it to the cookie, we're attaching it to an ID, and that ID is a combination of the different devices that an individual may use, again, all anonymously. And what you have the opportunity, again, to do here now is tie the exposure that either that ID or that cookie has seen from a media perspective back to what transaction may have happened in the offline world, and you begin to get an understanding of how your digital media is affecting your offline sales. So it's still a complicated process, but one that we're seeing advertisers over and over again use to help understand that digital impact in the offline world.
Fantastic. Leslie, this question is directed toward you. There was a number of very intriguing findings in the survey, and and some which indicated pain points, marketer pain points. Were there any findings that were a particular surprise to you, and what actually were the greatest challenges that you feel marketers are encountering today when it comes to this new data-driven world that they live in?
Thanks, Chris. Well, what I find interesting and not surprising is that the key challenges faced have to do with the amount of time and energy that's being spent on campaigns and working across, working across multiple vendors. So if we think about how we can help streamline that process to make sure that the job being done on a day-to-day basis is more efficient, what we find is that having the ability to tie data together, we talk about data management not sitting in silos across the organization, that's really just the first step in aggregating all of that data into one place, normalizing it. But at the end of the day, you want to know what to do with that data, because we would all, I think, agree that we don't need more data. We actually need more insights from the data. And so when you're tying the data normalization piece of it to attribution, so where are your conversions happening, and then tying that to actual analytics and measurement that are giving you more information about what to do next. So if I think about a campaign manager who has a certain amount of money to spend, if I'm looking at data in real time where I can see what's working and what's not, I then have the ability to make changes to my buy or changes to my campaign while it's actually in flight. So instead of waiting 30, 60, or 90 days until my campaign is finished, looking at the results and then deciding, I guess I'll change something the next time around, now marketers are demanding some of that data in real time so that they can actually be better at their jobs. And so I see that as a common trend as we move forward, is marketers looking for this type of solution that helps alleviate the day-to-day pains that they have.
Sounds great. One of our attendees asks about ROI measurement tools. Of course, it was very clear that that ROI measurement is number one in marketers' wish list when it comes to reporting and analytics. And one of our attendees asks if either of you have any insight into the top utilized ROI measurement tools that might have been shared in the survey or what you're seeing out there in the field.
I'd be happy to comment. I think we see attribution tool sets as one that continues to drive a fair amount of return on investment. I think we see analytics that are built on top of DMPs as a huge area of return on investment, and most of that is driven across a handful of categories. I think in the media side of the equation, we see things like unique user overlap, optimal frequency, all the classic media metrics that you want to fine-tune, not only overall, you want to fine-tune for each campaign, because frankly, campaign to campaign, optimal frequency can change. And then obviously the media partners and the success of each media partner may change based on message or audience or campaign. So that's kind of one dimension. The other would certainly be tool sets around audience. We're obviously in an increasingly programmatic world, and in that world, audience is very, very important. So we continue to see not only analysis at the audience level, I'm beginning to see people use analysis at the attribute level, which not all the tool sets on the market can do, but really driving into this audience works, but it works even better when I focus on the following attributes of that particular audience. I'd also like to, Chris, there was a comment made about the offline to online, that there are other ways to track offline to online, and I agree completely. Certainly you can use call tracking numbers like a 1-800 number. I think you can also use, we have clients who use email. So when somebody purchases something from the client, they send an email welcome notice out. That welcome notice can be tagged, whether it's offline, meaning at the store, or online from the website, the actual transaction. And that data can be fed back into the model to understand what media was seen and what factors drove that action, both online and offline, even to compare them. I think we'll see a world where you'll be able to do that at the device level fairly quickly as well to understand, things like I've got older children, but my children consume media in a very different way than my wife and I consume media. And frankly, the way that you advertise to me versus my daughter may be different. And I think understanding that will help advertisers, again, with their return on investment.
Got it. Excellent observation. Leslie, one of our attendees asked about the notion of streamlining vendors. One of the survey questions cited the multiplicity of vendors, and your analysis would be, well, perhaps it would be a good idea to streamline these vendors for campaigns. Do you have any sense of how to streamline by types of vendors, which could profitably be redirected or increased, reduced, increased, and how to blend the best of all of them? And, of course, Rob, feel free to jump in about that as well.
So that's an interesting question because it is something that we talk about almost on a daily basis with a lot of our advertisers. And if I had to put it into buckets, I would say that having measurement and analytics tied to data, number one, has to happen. I think number two, if you think about the actual execution of campaigns, marketing automation, and then if you think about the creation of campaigns, so the creative process, the content, and the planning. If I had to put it into three buckets, because we saw that today people are using on average 6.6 vendors to execute one campaign. So I can't say that there's anybody out there I see today that you can get it down to one vendor, but I see it, the potential of getting down to three that are best in class in those areas. So if you think about the creative process and the planning, there are a handful of vendors that have tools that help with that, and they may add on analytics and measurement, which might be good enough for you. What we find a lot of times is you want best in class across these different sets. So creative, for example, or the marketing automation piece. So you're tracking your lead generation, you're tracking your prospects through a sales funnel, and that has value. But then you're also tracking all of your different campaigns across channels and looking at the KPIs that make sense to you. So I think that's one other point to think about as you're streamlining vendors is to think from a high level, what are the KPIs that I care about? Because we've seen over time the KPIs have changed dramatically. So some people still work in clicks, but I would say a lot of what we're seeing is that the click-through rate is no longer the metric everyone cares about. A lot of it now is going to cost per unique or exclusive users, exclusive reach, which is all around being able to not only reach your current target audience, but actually find more people that look like your best customers. So reach extension is one piece where we see people moving towards, and so I would say looking at those KPIs and understanding the vendors you're working with, and can they actually deliver metrics that correlate to the KPIs that you care about is something that you need to make sure that you align on before you go down that path.
Chris, I'd add,
yeah,
this is an interesting area. Frankly, one we struggle with. So as kind of a centralized data and analytics platform, we struggle with what to integrate and who to integrate. I see things today like viewability, audience delivery. There's a ton of video metrics that are delivered by the video ad servers and DSPs. You've got heat mapping. Do people hover over your ad? Do they not? Mobile has its own set. So I don't envy, either the advertiser or the agency that's assembling all these metrics. Each vendor brings their own different set. You've got Nielsen, you've got ComScore, you've got Moat, you've got guys like AdTruth. Each of the individual or what I would call specialized media delivery, programmatic DSPs, video DSPs, mobile DSPs. They all have their own set. I think that I would agree with Leslie that understanding what metrics really matter to you first is the most important, and then I think second is working to integrate those into whatever centralized data infrastructure that you've decided on. This also brings me to another comment that was made by one of the viewers is, how do I go about doing this? It seems daunting. Frankly, large advertisers and even mid-sized advertisers in the digital world have significant spends, and using your spend as leverage to force your media partners into your model is really a great strategy and a great way of going about this. I see the agencies beginning to do this. We have a fairly large relationship with Omnicom, and I see them every day asking the media partners that work with them to provide the data back in a way that they can centralize it, organize it, and analyze it for their clients. And I see the same opportunity for advertisers. So I think whoever made that comment is spot on. I think you have to use your leverage. If you don't ask, then you will end up with 7 different reports from 7 different vendors that you're going to have to collate, normalize, and organize together.
Yes, and that would be a nightmare. Just to advance that answer, Leslie mentioned about click-through rates as obviously being a key metric. Rob, Leslie, do you have any thoughts about once all the data is centralized, what key metrics, let's say outside click-through rates, should be used to drive decision making here?
Yeah, I have a few. I bucket them into 3 areas, and then I think there are what I would call filter agents on top. The first is your user, and it's all about uniqueness. So what's my cost per unique user? What's the cost per unique user by pub? So let's say, for instance, I have 2 media partners. I'm finding they have a lot of overlap between one another. Which media partner do I cut? Probably the one that has the higher cost per unique user. So there's a whole slew of user metrics, I think, that you're beginning to calculate. And then you layer in transactions or actions. So whatever action I am desiring. If I'm a retailer, it's obviously a purchase. If I'm a CPG company, it may very well be a video play. If I'm an automotive company, maybe getting somebody to fill out a custom build on my website. So now you take those same user metrics and you begin to go ahead and calculate them on top of actions or transactions. So, what is my cost per action? What is my cost per unique action? How do those things fit across the different audiences and the different media partners? I've mentioned a number of times frequency. I think frequency and optimal frequency are important by media partner. And then when I talk about filters, this is where I get into thinking like a Rubik's Cube. So I might have groups of campaigns. So my social campaigns, my upper funnel campaigns, my lower funnel campaigns, my retargeting campaigns, my mobile campaigns, my video. So the ability to take all of my campaigns and begin to bucket them into combinations that make sense for my business, and then running all of these metrics across those combinations. So imagine being able to understand within the social environment where I get my best cost per unique user, or understanding from an actions perspective what my cost per action is from one media partner to the other, or one campaign group to another. So again, I think that we like to think of a set of metrics and then a set of filters below that allow you to tweak the data according to the campaign that you're currently running. That's how I would think you really want to look at this going forward. And a lot of those metrics are metrics that can often be calculated specific to the advertiser. And again, this goes back to the single version of the truth. Often the data that we utilize for return on investment calculations is data we calculate from data that we receive. And so as long as we can receive the data, normalize it, and put it in one place, it becomes very easy to calculate metrics that make sense for me.
Got it. Super. Leslie, in your survey report about the rationale for reporting, obviously ROI measurement was at the top, followed by spend planning and creative planning. But I noticed, and one of our attendees noticed, that channel selection came in at number 4, a very, very practical consideration. And the question is, in regards cross-channel marketing, can you give an example of what channels we should be looking at and which will grow the most in 2015? And obviously, Rob, if you want to jump in after Leslie is finished, please do.
That's a great question, because that's the holy grail that everyone's looking to find out, is where should they be investing those digital dollars. And so what I think is interesting is making sure that you are getting the analytics and the measurement across the different channels that you're looking at. And when I say different channels, think of this as search, social, display, mobile as the different channels. So the ability to look at your metrics not only across all of your social campaigns, but also look at a campaign that you might be running across the different channels will help you fine-tune that spend as you go forward. And so the question was around examples of what we should be looking at. One of the things that Neustar puts out every quarter is a media intelligence report. And what it does is it looks at all of the data that we're tracking anonymously for our advertisers and looks at the different channels. So we might look at portals, social, exchanges, and ad networks to give a sense of how they're trending from a cost perspective, a reach perspective, a user quality perspective, as Rob mentioned, so looking at unique users, and then also from a funnel attribution perspective. So not only understanding the cost of channels over time, but also the influence that those channels have in a conversion. Because oftentimes if you're not looking up the customer journey and you're just looking at where that conversion happened, you might be spending money on that channel, for example an exchange, which is where the transaction happens, without recognizing that somebody actually went to that company's website or maybe went out to their social network to gather information before they went and made that purchase. The other point I wanted to make, so if we look at what's growing in 2015, what we've seen with the data is that mobile, obviously, is trending up for 2015, as is video. And so I think Rob can probably speak a little bit more to those two.
Yes, certainly video and mobile continue to increase. I think there's a couple of answers in here, Chris. I think Leslie's done a great job of talking about the channels. I think that more and more advertisers are looking at media mix modeling, or have done it for years without digital included. I've run into a lot of advertisers who for years have done media mix modeling but excluded digital because frankly digital wasn't a large enough spend to worry. And now as digital continues to increase, they're beginning to need to find ways to take that digital data and include it in their media mix modeling. And I think that's a great example of what this study is all about, which is organizing and normalizing your digital data not only helps you understand how digital works and how to build a better ROI out of your digital spend, it also helps you feed the other areas within the media analytics space, namely this sort of media mix modeling, to understand how digital impacts other forms of media, television, print, direct mail, in any other offline that an advertiser might be doing. So I think there's a huge opportunity for digital to become a bigger part of an overall media strategy at an advertiser.
Got it. So much of this is a bit mind-boggling, I would think, with the marketer sitting back and trying to understand how he or she might handle all of this himself or herself. Himself or herself alone, I should say. One of our attendees asked about the issue of hiring. Maybe Leslie or Rob, you could address this. How important, how critical, to what extent should marketers address the issue of hiring key people who know about digital marketing and are experts in data analysis to help these poor beleaguered marketers?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting. So, frankly, those of us on the vendor side have the same problem. So, the biggest challenge I see at Neustar from a growth perspective is having more folks who really understand the digital space. It's an industry-wide problem. I mean, I think the best way to go about it is certainly this industry has no shortage of trade shows. I think it's important to get yourself out and visible in trade shows to meet the different vendors, meet the different people, both on the media selling, the media buying, and the data and analytics side. I think that's a great source of talent that you as an advertiser can source. I know that and this is probably not not a fantastic thing to put out, but we do see movement from agency to client. I've actually seen movement from client to agency as well. I'm not advocating either one, but I think that the more you get involved in the industry and the more you get involved in the people and the shows and the things that go on around the industry, the better you are able to source talent. I think that's a way better way than the old traditional recruiter or even LinkedIn ways. I think when you meet people at these sorts of events, it gives you a pretty good understanding of who really has value to add in this process.
Absolutely. Leslie, would you like to add anything there before we wrap up?
No, I'm good. I think Rob covered it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. Please note that you can download the Neustar white paper, How to Swim in Data, Why Managing Multiple Data Sources Doesn't Have to Be a Struggle, to which so much of today's webinar was based. All you have to do is click the Resources widget at the bottom of your screen. That's the second one from the right, and you'll get that white paper, How to Swim in Data. And you can also view and listen to this presentation on demand using the same link you used to attend today. So you'll receive an email as soon as the archive is ready. Now finally, before you go, please take a moment to fill out a brief exit survey about today's webinar. And you can do that by clicking on the red widget, which is to the extreme far right at the bottom of your screen. Well, thanks everyone for attending Ad Age's custom webcast sponsored by Neustar. On behalf of our guests, Leslie Petry and Rob Gatto, thank you for your time. This has been Christopher Hosford with the Ad Age team. Have a great and prosperous day.
Thank you.
Thank you.